So now I'd like to create the second component in this UI library, and that is going to be a drop down. So it's going to be some kind of title. When you click on that, it's going to drop down some content, some information. Then when you click on the title again, it's going to hide the information and so forth. So first of all, we need some kind of HTML template for this. I'm going to do an H2 first of all for a title. We'll just call that services. And then underneath, I'm just going to paste in this little template and explain it. So we have a couple of different divs. Each one of these has a class of dropdown. So each one of them is a separate dropdown. So we have two. Then inside we have this div in both. And this div is the title. Now they both have a class of trigger. So they are going to be the things that trigger the dropdown. When we click these divs, it's going to show or hide the content underneath. And this right here, this other div underneath the trigger, is the content that we're going to show or hide in each case. So if we save this at the minute and come to the browser and just refresh, it's going to look something like this. So by default, we want all of this content to be hidden. And when we click on these things, it's going to show. And then if we click on it again, it's going to hide the content. So then, let us first of all create a new JavaScript file. In fact, I've already done that. It's called dropdown.js. And inside here, now we're going to create our class for the dropdown. So this is going to look like this: class dropdown. And then inside the dropdown, and make sure you spell this correctly, inside the dropdown we need to make a constructor. So let's do that. And again, what we're going to do is pass in this time a container. And this container is going to be this thing right here. So this is a container that contains the trigger and the content. So we're going to pass in a container like this to the dropdown class, and that is going to initialize it for us. So when we're creating these dropdowns, we're going to create, probably for this project, 2 class instances, one for each dropdown, because each one of these is a separate container. So we'll pass each one of these into a separate class instance right here. So inside the constructor, I'm going to say this.container is equal to the container. And then underneath that, this.trigger is equal to container. Then I'm going to chain on a query selector, which we can do. So it looks inside the container for a trigger class. Okay, so we get the trigger, the thing that we click on, and then we're going to get the content. So we say this.content is equal to container again, and then .query selector again to get the div with a class of content. Okay, so now we have those things stored on the class itself. The next thing we need to do is make an init method, and inside this method we need to basically show and hide the content when the user clicks on the trigger. So we're going to attach an event listener to this trigger. So to do that, we'll say this dot trigger and then dot add event listener. And then inside this event listener, we're listening for a click event. It's going to fire a function when this happens, when we click on the trigger. And inside this, I'm going to say this dot trigger dot class list dot toggle. And then we're going to toggle the active class. So if we click on the trigger and it doesn't have the active class, we're going to give it that. If we click on the trigger when it does have the active class, we're going to take it away. And the same goes for the content. So this.content.classlist dot toggle, and we want to toggle exactly the same class, active. So what I'm going to do now is just export this at the bottom, export dropdown as default. So now we can import this from index.js over here. So let's say at the top, import dropdown from, and we want to go into the current directory, then ninja-ui, then / dropdown, like so. So now we have that, we can go ahead and create these dropdown instances. So remember, we want to create 2. We want to create one for the top one over here and another for this. So let's now query the DOM for both of these, first of all. So we'll go inside index, and I'm going to say create dropdowns. And we're going to get references to these dropdowns inside the HTML file first. So const dropdowns will be equal to document.query selector. And we want all, because we're getting every dropdown on the page. and then we want the drop down classes. So that's all of these things right here. So there's 2 of them on our page. It's going to get a list of those 2. Now we need to cycle through that list of those, and we need to create a new drop down instance for each one of them. So the way we do that is by saying dropdowns and then dot for each, because remember this returns a node list and we can use for each on a node list. So for each one, we'll refer to each one as a drop down and fire this callback function, and we're going to create a new instance for each drop down. So we'll set that equal to a new drop down and pass in the drop down we are currently iterating, which is this thing right here. So now we have that instance, we can initialize it by saying instance.init. So this is going to set up the constructor for each drop down right here. Then for each one, it's going to set up this event listener on the trigger itself, so the title. So when we click it, it's going to toggle these active classes from the trigger and the content. So let me just demo this so far, save it, and come over here. I'm going to inspect this thing first, and we can see this trigger and this content. Now when we click on this trigger, we can see it gets an active class, and so does the content. And if we click it again, we remove it. Click it again, it gets it. Click it again, removes it. And the same is true for the next one down here. So if I open this up, if we click on this trigger, then it adds it. Click on it again, it removes it. If we click on the content, then nothing happens because we're not attaching an event listener to that. This is the thing, the trigger that is controlling whether we show this or hide it. So now we have those active classes and the JavaScript functionality sorted. All we really need to do is show and hide these things dependent on the active classes. So again, we're going to create a CSS file for this dropdown. I've already created that over here. I've called it Dropdown for some reason. So let me rename that and just change it to Dropdown. I swear I can't spell at the best of times. And then we're going to go into dropdown.css and we're just going to paste this stuff right here from my repo, and I'm going to explain it again. So first of all, we're styling the trigger, the thing we click. We're giving this a border bottom, a padding of 10 pixels, position relative, and cursor pointer. So when we hover over, we get that little finger. So the dropdown trigger after, remember, this is a pseudo class that allows us to add some content after a certain element. The content we want to add is a chevron. So we're going to add this after the text inside the trigger. And it's going to display as inline block, so it's on the same line. Position absolute. Then from the right, it's going to be 15 pixels. So this chevron is going to be all the way on the right of the text of the trigger. Then we're doing a transform to rotate it 90 degrees. So that means it's going to rotate 90 degrees in a clockwise fashion so that this will look a bit like a V instead, because it becomes something like this when we rotate it 90 degrees. So when we do that, we're also going to rescale it a bit just to stretch it out, then give the font weight of bold. And for the transition, the transform, this property right here, when we rotate it, that's going to be 0.3 seconds. So that when we have the active class right here, the after element, which is now this content, we're going to change that to be minus 90 degrees so that it goes up, and it's like this caret symbol instead, this thing right here, and that's what it's going to look like. And now we're transitioning this transform over 0.3 seconds, so it just makes it a bit smoother. Now then, the drop-down content by default is going to display none, and then when it has the active class, it's going to display as block. So now let's import this into dropdown.js. I'm going to go to the top and say import, and it's going to be from the /styles folder /dropdown.css. So now we've imported that. We should see it on the page. Save it and come over here, and now we can see we get these little chevrons that have rotated 90 degrees downwards. When we click on this title, we should get an active class, and when we get an active class, it's going to make this arrow go the opposite way up, and also we should see the content. So click on this and we see the content because now this has a class of active, and when we have a class of active on the content, we see it. When we click on this again, then we see that now it hides the content, and the same is true for this thing. So this is all working now. That is the second component done, dropdowns. So in the next video, we'll move on to the third component, which is going to be tabbed content.